Welcome to the Chopin channel. I'm Roberto Poli. This video continues our exploration of Chopin's Polonaise Fantaisie in A-flat major opus 61. After recording the first video, I realized my analysis may have been a bit technical, so I hope it's okay for me to use some terms that might sound a bit complicated. I decided to have Vincent Ong's performance of the Polonaise Fantaisie at the 2025 Chopin Competition because I was planning to have a review of his interpretation, but also a video of the piece itself. The Polonaise Fantaisie is a fascinating work, in many ways mysterious and difficult to understand. So I hope that the video accompanied by Vincent's playing makes it a little easier to appreciate it. Sometime at the end of this video, I'll also make a point to explain the choice of the title for this two-part video, Exile and Redemption. But before we continue, if you end up liking the content of this channel, feel free to subscribe, like, share, and all those things that help the algorithm. I appreciate your support. In my last video, I went through an analysis of more or less the first half of the Polonaise Fantaisie and ended it by discussing the structure that Chopin chose for the piece. To review briefly, a Polonaise is generally in ternary form, ABA. A Fantaisie, on the other hand, is a free form that doesn't commit to any particular standard. That is already a problematic undertaking. In the Polonaise Fantaisie, Chopin uses the ternary form of the Polonaise, but superimposes on it the idea of sonata form. What is sonata form? Just like the Polonaise, sonata form is a ternary form. The opening section, called exposition, presents two themes, generally in different keys and connected by a bridge, and closes with a section we call coda. The second section is called development, in that it develops the material presented by one of the two themes, or both. The third section is called recapitulation, in which the exposition is restated. However, the key used for the second theme here changes in order to end the piece in the right key. This is done because in the exposition, the key of the second theme was different from the main key of the piece. Chopin's experimental approach with the sonata form idea superimposed to a different form, in the case of the Polonaise Fantaisie, the ABA of the Polonaise, is innovative. At the end of part 1, I mentioned that in the Polonaise Fantaisie, the two main themes are introduced in piano, then reorchestrated, so to speak, and presented in some sort of abbreviated recapitulation. So far in our exploration, we only encountered one of the two themes. The reason being that the second theme is featured in the B section of the Polonaise ABA form. Isn't it brilliant? Chopin constantly challenged the status quo, and the exploration of alternative forms was always a big preoccupation in his work. The last thing we discussed in part 1 was how the first theme, appearing early on in a major key, reappears a few pages into the piece, this time in a minor key. This return of the first theme determines the beginning of the development section of the sonata form structure of the piece. Here, Chopin is developing the first theme not only by casting it in a minor key, but also with the left-hand accompaniment presented in triplets rather than with the distinct Polonaise rhythm that we find the first time. Here, the right hand features the melody, but also small chords in the lower part, which add harmonic punctuation. Chopin's interpretive direction for this return is agitato, agitated. I think Vincent's reading of this section is marvelous, with great control of voicing and balance of parts, and with slight misalignments between the hands. The way the triplets in Vincent's hands cast the agitation requested by Chopin is truly terrific. There's also a very convincing sense of forwardness that carries the music to its destination. mentioned that I would occasionally refer to the early sketch. This is one of those moments. Originally, Chopin had elaborated the entire opening episode beyond the 8 measures that he ultimately included. Here is how he continued the development of the first theme. The sketch shows that Chopin abandoned this idea. He decided to make a cut by marking a cross that jumps to another spot on the same page of the sketch, where we find the continuation of the passages we more or less encountered in the final version. It's relatively easy for us to piece all this together because we know how the music goes. And of course, Chopin himself understood perfectly how this apparent chaos was organized. As we find the continuation of the episode in the sketch, we see that through chromaticism, the music shifts quickly to the key of B flat major. At the top of the same page, however, we also notice how Chopin had initially notated this episode in the key of B major, not B flat major, and how he had configured some connecting material, in this case roughly sketched, because it presents the wrong metric setup as the two sections join. Here's the early version of the new episode in B major, coming from the early version of the first theme in agitato with accompaniment in triplets. Despite the beauty of this passage, Chopin's plans changed. I'll discuss the possible reasons behind casting this episode in a different key in a minute, and why Chopin had originally envisioned this section in the key of B major. The relatively brief episode that Chopin chose to cast in the key of B flat major, renouncing the version we just heard, is crucial because it introduces a melodic idea that will return when we reach the emotional heart of the piece before the recapitulation. This beautiful episode in B flat major is vaguely informed by the Polonaise rhythm, but also by runs and ornaments that are clearly derived from the world of opera. Vincent arrives to it quite straightforwardly, but the way he intones it is exquisite, with a beautiful cantabile line, while at the same time preserving the direction of the Polonaise. This lyrical theme is suddenly interrupted by a cadenza-like passage that progressively modulates to the key of B major. This extended improvisation, also vocal in nature, supported by bass octaves and chords in the tenor register, almost an orchestral effect, enters one of the most cryptic regions of the entire work. It's a puzzling moment, and probably one of the passages that led Liszt to find Chopin's late works perplexing. I admire how Vincent inflected these 2 pages. Listen to how he groups the 16th notes into subphrases, allowing the listener to identify the melodic pattern in place by defining the breathing points of a very long melodic line. This cadenza-like episode ends just as expected in the most bizarre way. A right-hand solo meandering through highly chromatic melodic material and landing on an F sharp, the destiny of a truly torturous moment in the piece, and in that respect, Liszt wasn't wrong when he said that Chopin's late works displayed tortuosity of thought. To this F sharp, Chopin adds a chord whose tones extend the tension, a chord that we find spelled exactly the same way in the coda of the Scherzo in B minor, opus 20, in triple forte this time. The cadenza comes to an end with more reassuring tones, cadencing to B major. Here we must revisit the sketch because something really intriguing happened. The extensive cadenza-like passage I just described originally led to the key of C major instead of B major, the key of the middle section of the piece. This episode is not only the B section in the ABA structure of the Polonaise, but also the second thematic block for the sonata form aspect of the structure. Once he began refining this large portion of the Polonaise Fantaisie, I suspect that Chopin began to question the key of the opening of the piece, C minor, perhaps because he ended up concluding the piece in the key of A flat major. Confirming the key of C for the middle section would have been fine had the tonal center of the opening remained C minor. But while reworking the introduction to fit the key of A flat, he must have decided to shift the key of the middle section, now no longer related to the new home key. The new second chord of the first measure, C flat major, also foreshadows in a way this new key, because B major is simply a different spelling of C flat major. Chopin then must have decided to recast the B major episode that we heard in my reconstruction a few minutes ago to a different key to avoid the extended presence of the key of B major for 4 pages of music. Reworking all this must have taken a huge effort, particularly because the section affected is about 1/3 of the piece. I should also mention again an aspect that emerges from the sketch, which is possibly the most relevant discovery. This precious document, unprecedented in the sources that survived of Chopin's works, reveals that the Polonaise Fantaisie was not conceived as a Polonaise at first. We mentioned several times already that the characteristic Polonaise rhythm appears only at a later stage, added on to the already existing accompanying material. And so, When Chopin told his family that he was writing something for which he hadn't found a title, it's likely because he had no idea that the piece would eventually take the direction and shape it did when he sent it to his publishers.
The question then is, what was the piece in its original conception? After seeing part one, Jeffrey Kahlberg, the Chopin scholar responsible for authenticating many important autographs, including Chopin's Little Waltz in A minor revealed to the world about a year ago, kindly wrote me about the sketch of the Polonaise Fantaisie. As a young assistant professor, Kahlberg wrote about the sketches, but back then he could only work from photographs, which made it impossible to know things about the structure of the manuscript and even about what was on the reverse sides of the pages, which Chopin left blank. In 2024, he had the opportunity to see the original manuscript of the sketches, and it was intriguing to discover, said Kahlberg, that on the back side of the second page, Chopin wrote in ink, Sonata. Someone later crossed this out in pencil. Possibly Chopin did this? The sketch for the Polonaise Fantaisie was jumbled together with those for the cello sonata, says Kahlberg. So it's possible that the inscription sonata referred to the cello sonata. But it is a possibility that it applied to the Polonaise Fantaisie, a further sign of Chopin's uncertainty about what to call the piece. And if he did mean it to apply to the sketches for the Polonaise Fantaisie, asks Kahlberg, what kind of sonata was this going to be? What were the other movements going to be?
The B section, in the key of B major, begins with a brief chordal introduction, almost religious in tone. The main body of this section is, for all practical purposes, a duet, one voice in each hand, with an accompaniment based on alternating chords in the right hand, which define both harmony and accompaniment. This may look easy, but it is in many ways a technically demanding moment, because the right hand has to manage the intonation and inflection of the soprano line, while at the same time mitigate the invasive nature of the swiveling chords in the eighth note accompaniment. In turn, the left hand casts a beautiful tenor line, while also providing the relevant bass notes. Two expressive harmonic turns stand out for me. A cadence to D sharp minor, what we call the mediant, the third degree of the scale, and a shift to B flat major, spelled in A sharp major, which happens to be a harmonic reference to the key of the section presented before the cadenza-like transition. After the detour to A sharp major, through an extraordinary chromatic pivot, we return to B major. This moment always takes my breath away, even just on paper. Chopin shifts chromatically one note at a time until he finds himself back in B major. The theme is then restated with an embellished variant, harmonically venturing into the implied keys of E and F sharp major, then through chromaticism dissolving into silence, ending on what we call a German sixth chord, a chord of great tension that generally resolves. But here it doesn't. Everything for the first time stops. Silence. It's a puzzling moment in which doubt pervades the narrative. Where are we headed with this? Here, Vincent gives a reading of this long section that is essential, devoid of overly emotional content, with perfectly balanced right hand playing and with an approach defined by his trademark phrasing. Nothing will ever be heard the same way. As a matter of fact, this section is very much based on a repeated motif, and Vincent outlines it with different shades in each repetition, whether in its first presentation in simple quarter notes or in its variant as it returns. After the silence, which in Vincent's hands is rather brief as to not lose the thread of the Polonaise, a passage of extraordinary inspiration begins. For me, the heart of the Polonaise Fantaisie. Here, emotions unfold with distinct tones. The desire to regain what has been lost, a spark of hope, and sudden resignation. A memory lingers, ultimately dissolving into dream. All this is overtly vocal, even operatic. particularly as we hear the measure characterized by rapid dotted figurations, which reaches the high register, then cascades back to the starting point of the episode. Vincent's reading of this section, which closes the B section of the ABA structure of the Polonaise, but also the development of the sonata form structure, is inflected with great expression without losing the forward motion of the Polonaise. He infuses each phrase, fragment, turn with different dynamic intensity. This section is vaguely related to the brief lyrical section that preceded the cadenza-like passage before the middle section, not only in the rhythmic layout of the melody, but also in the way the left hand structures the accompanying figures in eighth notes. A series of trills, single, double, triple, nearly quadruple, leads back to the recapitulation. Vincent's, in my opinion, are the best trills in the 2025 Chopin competition. Why did I say nearly quadruple? Because Chopin doesn't quite complete the fourth trill in the lower voice, but only adds a note, C sharp, which gives the impression that there's a full trill while making it playable by avoiding a double trill in the left hand. The increasingly intense trills bring back the material from the B major section. Then the introduction reappears in pianissimo as a recapitulation, confirming the key of B major. Vincent plays this moment with great objectivity, not quite as a return, but as a destination. Chopin uses the same harmonic strategy as in the opening, but only one pair of gestures is presented, this time turning towards C major. The theme we heard earlier, what I described as the heart of the piece, returns only in a fragment, in the key of F minor, then rising to the key of A flat major, its relative major. A winding, turbulent transition in which the Polonaise rhythm reasserts itself leads to a chromatic surge, a crescendo of volume and momentum that drives us to the return of the first theme, now presented in full orchestral force, sustained by octaves and chords. We hear both phrases here, which by now have been presented in three very different incarnations. The first, in its simplicity, the second, in its parallel minor, with triplets in the accompaniment, and the third, in its orchestrated version. A sudden harmonic turn diverts us to B major, not a coincidental choice, I think, because it recalls the key of the middle section. Here, a trill and a virtuosic scale launch us into a heroic gesture in the treble register. Then comes another twist, this time to G major, followed by a chromatic ascent back to A flat, which heightens the tension. Let's listen to the entire episode. The second theme, the duet in B major, returns, now grandly orchestrated in the home key of A flat major. Let's hear it next to its first appearance. Vincent plays these final pages with remarkable lyricism, softening the virtuosity that often emerges in other interpretations. The balance between the voices is carefully judged, and even the fortes and fortissimos remain sensitive to the surrounding context. Yes, the music takes on an exalted tone, but it never becomes a display of empty virtuosity. The theme pushes forward triumphantly, ultimately leading to a sweeping coda in octaves. In my opinion, few moments in Chopin's entire output express patriotism as vividly as these final pages of the Polonaise Fantaisie. As the octaves tumble down, the music subsides and comes to a sudden turn to D-flat minor, casting a shadow over the ending. A trill in the left hand, almost like a distant timpani roll, signals the approaching close. The tension finally relents. The chord at the end, almost a cry, is both heroic and tear-laden. Vincent's interpretation of this moment is intense, particularly in the way he winds down the tension to the final measures. And so, in closing, we arrive at the title of these two videos on the Polonaise Fantaisie, Exile and Redemption. Why these two words? If any of Chopin's works conceals autobiographical traces, it may well be the Polonaise Fantaisie. By 1845, Chopin likely realized he would never see Poland or even his family again. The Russian occupation of Poland barred his return. For all practical purposes, Chopin spent his adult life in exile, and what that meant late in life must have become increasingly clear, particularly as his illness was tightening its grip. Could that awareness and knowledge, the grief of not being able to see his homeland free or not being able to see it again, have seeped into the extraordinary work that is the Polonaise Fantaisie? Perhaps by shaping the piece that he did not quite know what to call into a Polonaise, he symbolically brought into view the Poland that he carried within him, a nation wounded, but destined to rise again. Unfortunately, he would not live to witness the moment in which Poland would rise against the oppressor. Chopin died in 1849, and Poland would not regain statehood until 1918. For me, particularly significant in this reading is the longing tone of the central lyrical passage leading to the recapitulation. And the way the intimate B major dialogue, filled with tender memories, transforms into the heroic page that drives toward the coda. Its exalted tones seem to portray the Poland that Chopin longed to see, a Poland resurrected, free from the yoke of oppression. In that sense, there is redemption. One last look at the sketch reveals a rather different ending with what might appear to be a more successful set of chords. But perhaps that very predictability made Chopin opt for a more original ending. In my view, the final version, without the rhetorical two-chord close, proves even more successful. It becomes, as I hear it, a kind of suffocated cry. But is it a cry of relief, or is it a pleading gesture? The ambiguity for me is part of its power.